You know that feeling when you reread a story from your childhood and suddenly it means something completely different? Well, get ready for that, but on a massive, historical scale. We're about to look at Kenya's colonial past through the lens of one of the strangest, most familiar stories out there, Alice in Wonderland. Let's go down the rabbit hole.
So let's just sit with that for a second. What if one of the most famous kids' books ever written is actually the best way to understand the trauma of colonial rule? It's a pretty wild idea, right? But it really gets you thinking. I mean, what does happen when your entire reality gets replaced by someone else's bizarre fantasy? Okay, so who comes up with an idea like this? Well, it wasn't just a random thought. He came from a really fascinating thinker who connected dots that, honestly, most of us would never even see. Her name is Mildred Achok, and she's got this incredible background. She's a Kenyan poet, a screenwriter, a playwright, and the founder of something called Afro-Goth. On top of all that, she's a huge Victorian goth enthusiast. So you can see how this unique mix, her own Kenyan heritage and this deep dive into the Victorian era, put her in the perfect spot to see history in a totally new way.
And here's the story of how it happened. Picture this. It's November 21st, 2025, and she's just browsing online, reading an academic essay about Alice in Wonderland. And suddenly, boom, it all just clicks. The way the essay described Lewis Carroll's fantasy world, it wasn't just a story anymore. It felt like she was reading about her own country's colonial history.
So what was the first big connection she made? It was something really fundamental, something that both Alice and the people of colonial Africa experienced in a very real way. The idea of having all your boundaries just completely violated.
And this quote right here, from the exact essay Mildred was reading, is where it all started. It says that in Wonderland, boundaries are continually violated. Think about it, right? The lines between what's an animal and what's a human, what's polite and what's rude, what's order and what's total chaos, they're just all over the place. Alice gets dropped into this world where none of the basic rules she knows make any sense anymore.
Now, for Mildred reading that wasn't just literary analysis. It wasn't fantasy. It sounded exactly like African history. It was a perfect description of what it feels like when a foreign power just shows up and redraws your entire reality from scratch.
And this wasn't just a feeling, it was historical fact. Look at this timeline. You've got the Berlin Conference in 1885, where European powers literally just drew lines on a map of Africa, creating new countries without asking anyone who actually lived there. As Mildred noted, they just threw different ethnic groups together, creating this new, artificial wonderland called Kenya. The ground rules were being rewritten for sure, but from thousands of miles away.
Okay, so first the boundaries get completely blown up. What comes next? Well, a whole new set of rules. And these weren't just any rules, they were rules that must have felt just as nonsensical and bizarre as anything Alice had to deal with.
The poet W.H. Auden nailed this when he talked about the inverted logic of Wonderland. He points out that Alice has to learn to walk away from a place in order to reach it. Just try to wrap your head around that for a second. It's pure nonsense, right? It's the kind of rule that's specifically designed to make you feel lost and confused.
And this is where the comparison gets really, really powerful. Look at this. On one side, you've got Wonderland's crazy logic. On the other, colonial logic. And you have to ask, which one is actually more absurd? Walking away to get somewhere? Or being told you have to pay a tax to live in the house you already own? As Mildred noted, that must have seemed just as nuts as any riddle the Mad Hatter could come up with.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing. These were real policies that affected real people. You had the hot tax, the poll tax, and something called the Kipende system, which is basically a mandatory ID pass to control where people could go. You see, the point of these laws wasn't just to govern. It was about control. It was about creating that exact same sense of disorientation Alice felt.
But it gets even deeper. The parallels aren't just about the world and its weird rules. Mildred realized you could actually map the famous characters from Wonderland onto the real-life figures of the colonial period. This is where it gets really wild.
Okay, check this out. First up, the White Rabbit, always running late, obsessed with his watch. Mildred saw him as the missionaries, bringing Western ideas about time and religion. Then you've got the Mad Hatter. Who else could he be but the eccentric, often totally irrational colonial settlers, guys like Lord Delamere carving out their own little kingdoms? The grinning Cheshire Cat, who's there 1 minute and gone the next, that's the colonial government, the bureaucracy you can never quite pin down. And of course, the Queen of Hearts, always shouting off with their heads. Well, that's got to be the British Empire itself.
So you got to ask, right? Why?
Why would anyone create a world that's so bizarre and, frankly, so cruel? To even begin to answer that, we have to look inside the minds of the people who built this whole system, the Victorians.
This quote from the historian Harold Perkin really tells you everything you need to know. He describes the English as becoming inhibited, polite, orderly, prudish, and hypocritical. It was a society obsessed with appearances. On the surface, everything was prim and proper, but underneath all that politeness, a whole lot of repressed stuff and a ton of hypocrisy.
Imagine the pressure of trying to live up to those impossible standards all the time. It was so intense that, as scholars point out, it led to this whole idea of living a double life. You had one personality for polite society back home in England, but then you had another for when you were overseas in the colonies, a kind of Wonderland, where suddenly all those strict English rules didn't seem to matter anymore.
Okay, so we've gone pretty deep down this rabbit hole. What's the big takeaway from all this? Why is looking at history through the lens of a children's story so powerful?
Well, for one thing, this is way, way more than just a clever little literary game. This is really about empathy. It's about trying to understand the sheer psychological shock of waking up one day and finding that your entire world has been turned upside down. It helps us get past the dates and names in history books and start to feel what it was like to have your reality replaced by someone else's bizarre, frightening fantasy. It's a way to connect with the human side of history.
And that's the thought I want to leave you with. If a story like Alice in Wonderland can give us this whole new way of seeing history, what other stories are out there? What other fairy tales or myths, or even modern books could be keys to unlocking a deeper understanding of our shared past?